So you know you're talking to an old guy when he's described as the father of something. And so I really appreciate being the last guy between you and the drinks. So I'm going to talk as fast as I can. The subject of the talk is how to fail less. I wish I could tell you the subject was how to succeed more, but we might know how to do that in another 10 years. But now we've kind of figured out how to make startups fail less. And we know that because we've learned a lot. We didn't quite understand the difference between startups and large companies. And the distinction is that startups used to be thought of as smaller versions of large companies. Everything a large company did, your investors used to tell you, you need to do that as well. Large companies hire VP of sales, marketing, and biz dev on day one, you needed to do that. They used to write business plans, you needed to do that. Everything they learned in Harvard Business School, you're supposed to do that as well. We know that's just not true. What we now know is that startups search. In your first year, you're in search mode. We'll tell you what you're searching for, but large companies execute. And that distinction wasn't clear for the first 100 years of innovation and entrepreneurship. What we used to believe for strategy was all I need to do is execute the plan. Anybody ever write a business plan? Yeah. Well, here's what we know about a business plan. And by the way, anybody have to do Appendix A, the forecast in the back? Right? Anybody ever realize that it's called the 5-year forecast, the 5-year plan? Anybody ever make that connection that the Soviet Union used to have a 5-year plan? And this one's probably as valid as the Soviet 5-year plan. I now believe we ought to teach business plans still in universities and colleges, but they ought to be taught in the English department because they're best examples of creative writing we're ever going to see. Because what we now know is no business plan survives first contact with customers. It's a big idea. If anybody's done a startup, done creative writing, gee, I formatted it correctly, look at those great charts, you know, what a surprise, 5-year forecast says $100 million, blah, blah, blah. I used to tell my students there's a secret Excel code key to kind of auto-generate that, and there's still classes searching for those code keys. But essentially, you could put together a canonical plan which wouldn't last an hour and a half in front of customers. What we now know, this is the big idea, what we now know is that planning needs to come before the plan. What we need to do, instead of a business plan, we need to start with a series of hypotheses best exemplified in something called the business model. And I'll explain what the business model is in a couple minutes. But if you don't have this book, you ought to get it. It's by a guy named Alexander Osterwalder, and it's called Business Model Generation. Anybody ever see it before? Osterwalder basically says, look, you know, while you think you're doing sales and marketing, et cetera, you're actually trying to solve a business model problem. And I'll show you what a business model looks like in some detail. But I just want to point out that the first thing that startups are doing are searching for a business model. They're searching for a series of hypotheses and testing them, and only after they find them do you get to execute. That's when you get to write an operating plan and financial model, but I will contend you really don't know enough. Even though your VCs told you to do it and you learned it in school, excuse me, that's somebody's fantasy who actually never had the job. They write checks, but they've never done the job. Anybody who's actually built a startup knows all you have is a series of guesses on day one. And trying to make those guesses formatted correctly so somebody could approve the PowerPoint is just an exercise in futility on all sides. The next thing we used to believe is that we built startups by managing processes. You hire product management, you went into waterfall engineering, you know, we had a canonical diagram that looked something like this, you had a concept, you went to product development, alpha test, beta test, first customer ship. If you would have drawn that for the last 30 years, VCs would have high-fived you, told you we're a genius. You would have hired sales and marketing in that plan. You would have said, yeah, I need sales and marketing. We need to get buzz going. And, you know, where's our social media? And the TechCrunch article needs to show up over here, right? And it all looks, and it's culminating in first customer ship. And how we built the product was we did waterfall. We had a requirements document and design, and, you know, we locked it down, and we implemented, and we came out with release 1 at first customer ship. 2 fundamental problems with this idea and with this chart. First fundamental problem is it implies that you understand the customer problem you're solving. Now, maybe because you actually saw a burning bush and a voice came out and told you exactly what the customer problem was, but I kind of doubt it. Or maybe you think you and your co-founder understand the customer problem, but I doubt it. What happens as a consequence of you having some hallucination that you actually understand what problem you're solving is you also tend to make an egregious error of, let's go write the entire product because I understand all the features on day one. That's a failure strategy. Because I will guarantee you the safest bet in this room is, even though you think you are absolutely convinced you understand the customer problem and you're going to nail those first set of features, the safest bet is you're wrong. Because there's no possible way, sitting in your office or your room or your lab, that you can. Because entrepreneurship is an NP-complete problem. It can't be pre-calculated. Getting out of the building turns it just into an NP-hard problem, but it is fundamentally incalculable until you get out of the building. And so both the product management nature and the waterfall execution problem is what got us spending a lot of money and a lot of time inefficiently. What we now know for strategy is more startups fail from our lack of customers than from a failure in product development. And so what we want to do is have a process to get out of your office, get out of your building early, which we call customer development, to search for the truth. And so what we want to do is customer and agile development first, and then we could hire product management people, and then we could go into more extensive development. The third thing we used to believe is organization charts. You know, everybody used to sketch the org chart, and when I was a CEO, my fantasy was to have an org chart that looked like this, and this would just be my administrative staff, you know. And I wanted it to look, you know, massive people, etc. We also now know, and this is the most subtle problem, what we now know is that if you're hiring a VP of sales, head of marketing, head of biz dev on day one, you're screwed. Anybody know the average half-life of a VP of sales in a startup? 9 months. Right? In fact, anybody in sales? If you're in sales, you should go to a mirror because there's actually a bullseye painted to your back you've never actually noticed. The half-life is the shortest of any job, Silicon Valley. The mistake we made was taking those organizational theories from large companies that execute and assuming that that's what we're doing in a startup on day one. In fact, the other mistake is thinking that the same job specs that work in large companies work for startups. I used to think the best thing that could ever happen is I could hire a VP of sales from name of large company. And one day I actually got my wish. Start was about 8 people. I managed to hire a director of sales from Oracle. And what happened, I should have known better by then. We're now, I don't know, 4 months into the company. VP of sales and I, Jay Larson, great guy, are now calling on the 5th company in a row, and we just got thrown out again. I mean, I don't even mean we finished our presentation. I mean we were on like slide 6, and we must have put something offensive up again because we're standing in the parking lot in the rain. And we get into the car, and Jay is putting the key in the ignition. And I go, Jay, where are you going? He said, well, Steve, we're making our next sales call. I said, Jay, we were just thrown out 5 times in a row. He said, that's why you hired a world-class salesperson. We have thick skins. We just, you know, keep going. And I went, well, maybe we should think about why we're getting thrown out. He said, Steve, you just don't understand corporate sales. This happens all the time. And so I pull out, and he's driving. I'm pulling out the laptop, and I'm like typing away. And he goes, what are you doing? I said, Jay, the presentation obviously isn't working. I'm changing the slides. And the car almost goes off the road. He says, you can't do that. I've memorized those slides. Now, all of you ought to be laughing here because obviously this is the difference between search and execution. When you hire a world-class VP of sales who's been an executor, what they know how to do is execute pristinely against a known product, known price list, and known customer target set. We were making it up. He gets back on the road. I'm now typing something else. What are you doing? I'm changing the pricing structure. Almost went into the media. I fired Jay 4 weeks later. Turned out he was a world-class salesperson, and I needed him 18 months later. I didn't need him on day one, because on day one, what you really want is the founders running a customer development team. You want no sales, no marketing, no biz dev until you've found a repeatable and scalable business model. And so first you want to do customer development with a customer development team, and then you eventually want to hire functional organizations by department. It's not that you never want these people. It's just by the time you start layering in execution people, they're looking at their business card going, why, yes, we're executing on the PowerPoint slides. But your PowerPoint slides are probably changing every 30 days or more. You don't hire and build functional organizations till your PowerPoint stops moving. It's a good heuristic. All this stuff is covered in the Startup Owner's Manual, and ultimately your goal is to be an execution organization. But I will contend that all or most of you are in search. So first question is, what are you searching for? What's a startup? I did 8 startups in 20 years, and I don't think I ever had a formal definition. So let me give you Steve's startup definition. To me, a startup is a temporary organization. It's a big idea. There's no such thing as a 10-year-old startup. There's a 2-year-old startup attached to an 8-year-old failure. Keep that in mind for those of you looking at the calendar. Okay? Your goal is not to be a startup, even though the food's great and you bring the dog and it's whatever and it's collegiate. It's not the goal. The goal is that, believe it or not, a temporary organization designed to search. And the question is, what? I thought it's designed to code or build product or get customers or users. What's this designed to search about? I'll explain. It's designed to search for something that's repeatable and scalable, and what you're looking for is a business model. A startup is a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. Your goal is to become a company, not stay a startup. But the question is, what's a business model? And so, for me, it starts with this definition. So a business model is how a company creates value for itself while delivering products and services for customers. And it's kind of arbitrary. We could make up a business model of any components, but I kind of like this definition, which just says, a business model has 9 boxes. And the first one that's most important is, what's the value proposition? Which is a very fancy word for what's the product or service you're offering customers. And it's not about your idea or your product. It's what job are you getting done for a customer, or what need are you fulfilling or satisfying? And so understanding that it's not about here's our feature specs or even our benefits. It's about understanding you're fulfilling something for a series of customers. And the next question you need to ask is, who are they? Who's our customers? They don't exist to buy, which I used to think. You actually exist for them. Who are they? Why would they buy? Can you describe them by archetypes? Geographic, demographic, social, 24 years old, male, lives in urban areas. Next is, how am I going to get the product to these customers? What's my sales channel? And channels could be something as simple as, I'm selling on the web, I have a direct sales force, I'm using indirect channels. But something to keep in mind is that channels are radically different for web and mobile products than they are for physical channels. So in one case, you have to deal with Walmart or Best Buy. Another is you're dealing with the Apple Store, the Android Store, et cetera. And some things are even more complicated with indirect channels in between. The next thing you want to think about is customer relationships, which is a fancy word for how do you get, keep, and grow customers. How do I acquire them, activate them, and keep them? And customer relationships are probably the most expensive part of your business, particularly if you're in the web. How do I do customer acquisition? What's the sales funnel look like? How does it differ if I'm a mobile app from a web app, from a physical channel? And just like in thinking about your channels, these are very different for mobile versus physical. Revenue streams. How do you make money? Well, these are actually strategies. The revenue model is a strategy. Pricing is a tactic. And in some businesses, you'll have multi-sided markets. I'm acquiring users so I could sell them to advertisers. And so what you want to think about is, what value is the customer paying for? In Google, advertisers are actually paying for access to those users. And pricing is just a tactic. What key resources are you going to need? what are the most important assets for your business? So, for example, if you really think about any startup, you need money. So financial assets are important. Silicon Valley Bank. And I heard they're giving out money between now and when I've stopped talking. Physical assets, intellectual assets, and human assets. All these are kind of things you need to think about that make up your startup. And then next, what are the key activities? Excuse me, but next, what are the key partners? You know, the Apple iPod and iPhone and tablet would have been useless without third-party software. Both apps and music at first. Who are the key partners and suppliers necessary to make your model work? You know, what activities do you want them to do for you? Is it just to provide content, or to provide supply, or actually do something active for your business? And understanding these are just really important. Even on day one, will I need some potential partners? Key activities. Well, if you're in the software business, writing code is really important. But if you're in the manufacturing business, gee, it might be manufacturing skill, it might be mastering supply chain. So what you need to be thinking about, what are the important things the company must do to make your business model work? Production, problem solving if you're in consulting, manufacturing or supply chain, as I said, if you're making physical products. And you need to understand all of this because it rolls up, just like it rolled up for revenue on the right side of the business model, it rolls up into costs. What are the key costs and expenses in your business? So what are the costs to operate the business model? Are there fixed costs? Are there indirect costs? Now, in the old days, we'd make you do an income statement, balance sheet, cash flow. In fact, your bank probably requires that. But until you figure out all this other stuff and figure out what are the metrics that matter, it's not even easy to start this. So we kind of start with a cost structure. Now, even after you do all this, guess what? You're now left with a series of hypotheses. This is kind of looks exhausting, but you could do this very quickly. You could download this business model canvas from the web. You could post it on your wall. You and your co-founders could put yellow stickies on all those 9 boxes. But at the end, you're still left with 9 boxes full of hypotheses. Now, I got to tell you the truth. I use the word hypotheses because I teach at Stanford. Anybody go to Stanford? Okay. You know what tuition is now? $50,000 a year. So for every big word I use, people's parents feel like they've made money. So that's why I use the word hypotheses. But in reality, what we're doing is guessing. I will contend that almost every one of you have a business model full of untested and unvalidated guesses. Because here's the bad news about a startup. How many of you are founders? Okay? You have started a faith-based enterprise. It is. You know, don't BS me. You got the bank to believe it, but you know, it's a faith-based enterprise. But your job, truly, is to turn that faith-based enterprise into facts as quickly as possible. That's what makes a business. Right now, you have a series of, I believe. Great, good, you got other people to believe too. Founders need a reality distortion field. But you immediately, or as quickly as possible, need to turn that faith into facts. And that's what the next part is. Startups are in search, and what you're searching for is the truth. We use this business model canvas to kind of articulate these hypotheses, but how we turn these guesses into facts is with this customer development process I mentioned earlier. What we have is a formal process, 4 steps. Customer discovery, where we'll test some of the basic hypotheses, whether the customers believe in the problem or solution. Customer validation, where we'll actually try to sell the product. And then execution, where we'll try to scale the company. And so for customer development, it's kind of simple. First, you test the problem, and then you test the solution. The customer development process basically says, we're going to take our guesses, get out of the building, physically leave, talk to customers, and basically run a series of experiments, which start with these hypotheses. We'll design a series of experiments. We believe that customers will behave this way. We believe that percentage of activation should be like this. We believe, conversion down the funnel should look like this. We're going to run the test, and we'll get some data, but we're not just looking for data, we're looking for insight. Because that insight will change or modify our hypotheses. And we're continually running this hypothesis, experiment, test, and insight loop. And so the goal is to do this with something called the minimum viable product. Minimum viable product says, let's start with the smallest piece of the product that will teach us something. Instead of building every possible feature on day one, we're going to build the product iteratively and incrementally. And as we get out of the building, we're going to find out whether our hypotheses are correct. And what we do with that is something interesting. I drew a line in my first book. I never named it, and one of my students named Eric Ries. Anybody read Eric's Lean Startup book? If you haven't, you should all get it. Eric said, "Oh, Steve, that's the pivot." I went, "What a great name." So in fact, that's now so overdone, like people are trying to find some other name for it, but I still love it. A pivot, in my definition, is a substantive change to one or more of those 9 business model canvas components. Gee, you get out of the building, you discover who your customers you thought were male, 24 years old in urban areas, are middle-aged women in Nebraska. That's a pivot. Or you decide, or you figure out that the freemium model you thought was great, well, everybody believed in the free part, but there's no upgrade path. Gee, maybe you ought to go to a subscription model. Or you discover that the top 5 features you thought were important, customers love features 4 to 5. Right? Every one of those insights changes your business model canvas and your strategy. So the pivot is what happens when hypotheses don't match reality. So customer development is how you search for the model. And basically, I'm just going to go down through the customer discovery path, and the book you have will talk about the rest of it. This is a formal process on how to do this. Customer discovery has you stating your hypotheses, drawing out your business model canvas. Phase 2 has you getting out and testing the problem. If you're a web-based startup, you actually put up a minimum viable product on the web. We call it a low-fidelity MVP. And you're actually seeing whether people agree about the problem, not even about the features, but about the problem. And the next thing is you're going to test the solution. And right now, you're not selling anything. You're trying to see whether your faith matches facts. And then you verify or pivot. And so I'm going to stop here. You have the Startup Owner's Manual. This takes you in some detail. And I'm happy to answer questions. Oh, let me just give you one more, by the way. Let me give you one more. And that's why do we do this? Let me tell you why we do this. Anybody ever see this movie? Let's see if it works. Maybe not. Maybe we won't see the movie. Hello? Yeah? All right, we're not going to see the movie. Why we do this is because now it's working? Keep pressing? You're more optimistic than me. Press again? Yeah? Let's see if it works. All right. Try it. Click. Nope. Somebody's moving that cursor, not me. All right. Why we do this is because as entrepreneurs, we realize that there's nothing more important in our lives than to take the passion and the vision we have and make it real. I have to tell you, at least for me, doing 8 startups in 20 years, this was just something that was driving me. I believe entrepreneurs are closer to artists than anything else. While you might have been engineers, while you might have been MBAs or product managers, at the end of the day, founders of companies see things that other people don't. You see a vision and you want to make it real. And you build a company to actually make that happen. And for me, everything else was secondary. It was nice to make money. It was nice to build a team. It was great, to see my product used. But it was just something that I needed to make happen from a sketch on the dining room table until I built a company. And you're all on that journey. So I'm happy to take questions, and thank you very much. Questions? Yes.
So I'm a huge fan of your book, The 4 Steps to Epiphany. I'm curious what the difference is between this new book that you've released and The 4 Steps to Epiphany.
$40. So I'm in a banking conference. So no, let me give you an honest answer. So in 10 years, we've learned a lot. I'll tell you maybe the top 2 big ideas. One is the 4 steps to the Epiphany. I had this notion that we should organize our hypotheses, but I really didn't understand. In fact, it was before Alexander Osterwalder wrote the business model canvas. And when I saw it, I realized that was the world-class best way for an entrepreneur to organize their thoughts. And so customer discovery, which used to have its own worksheets with my own terminology, basically Alexander and I have worked together, and we're going to do another book together, et cetera, uses his methodology. So we didn't invent another one. Once you understand business model canvas, boom, that is the front end of customer discovery. The thing I added to Alexander's thinking was he was thinking of it as a static, 2-dimensional, you draw out your hypotheses. When you do customer development, you're adding a z-axis in time to the canvas, which he never thought about. And now, every time you update your business model canvas, you can actually watch the entrepreneurial process happen. So one is business model canvas is kind of the integrating scorecard. 2 is, and this one I pondered for a while, is that while the theory for physical products, stuff sold through Walmart, is the same as stuff sold on the Apple App Store, what you do for tactics are radically different, right? In the time you go out and finally get to Bentonville, Arkansas, you could have 10,000 users on an app store. And so there needed to be a parallel track. And so the book is written that there really are parallel paths about whether you're in a physical channel and web mobile channel. And so those are 2 of the many upgrades. This book is more tactical and prescriptive, and the other one was basically stream of consciousness. In fact, I'll tell you guys the secret story. The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, if any of you have read it, were my class notes from Berkeley. And when Eric Ries was a student, he said, "Why are you Xeroxing these things? You're on the board of Cafe Press. Why don't you have them printed and you could put it on Amazon?" So we have Eric to blame for all the unfinished sentences in there. And I thought it was a badge of honor that the thing was, my class notes were actually selling. And then I made it almost a joke, and you could finish the sentences yourself and come out with whatever theory you wanted. But so the Startup Owner's Manual, the intent was to actually take the book from class notes into something that was usable as an execution document. Long answer to a great question. Yes?
I have a question. Some startups are network effect startups.
Yes.
So in order for them to succeed, they not only need to solve some viable problem, they probably depend on something else like minimal user base.
Yes.
So how do you think is the lean approach different for that kind of startups?
Harder. No, seriously. It's harder, but you can't ignore it. So one of the things that you need to do in a networks effects business is see if you could simulate some of the network. That is, how can I simulate what would happen if I have 100 people actually referring here? I'll give you a parallel version, maybe a simpler example, because yours is hard, and I'm not trying to dodge it, but it is hard, but you could simulate part of it. Think about Google search, which I used earlier as an example of multi-sided market, which happens a lot. Think about it. If you think about Google search, there are hundreds of millions of users. Anybody use Google search? Anybody in the room? Graham, how much do you pay? How much do you pay? Nothing. But Google is the most profitable company in the world. 99% of it coming from search. Who's paying? Who pays? Advertisers. Well, think about it. Now, in the customer segment, you have 2 boxes, users and payers. Well, anytime you have 2 different customer segments, guess what? You have 2 different value propositions. Because if you go back to the value prop box, you're looking at the Google search bar. What's the advertiser seeing? What product are they seeing? AdWords. Oh, wait a minute. So now you have 2 different value props. You have 2 different customer segments. Guess what? You have 2 different revenue models. What's the revenue model for you? 0. What's the revenue model for advertisers? How do they pay? I'm sorry? Cost per click. Very interesting, all right? Now, so they're not the only one to have a user and payer model, right? It could be very easy for you to say, you know what? We're just going for 10 million users. We'll worry about payers later. Okay, no one's going to stop you from building that business and ignoring the users. But you know what? If I was advising you, I'd say, perhaps you ought to talk to one of your potential payers and just see if what you think is valuable now, gee, if I got 10 million of these, you know, your assumption is, oh, people will pay, you know, so many cents per these users. You might find out that the users you're acquiring happen to be stuff that people don't want at all. So I tend to have people go down through their business model and actually test each part of the model first. In your case, you have to simulate part of the model because there is a networks effects part. But I would actually try to test as much of the business model as you can. It doesn't mean that you need all the payers, but I would be figuring out how to test it. And I know that's not a complete answer, but that's as good as a dodge as I'm going to give you tonight. All right. Other questions?
When you have something very disruptive, and one thing that is thrown at you by customers is feature parity. They try to compare you with something that exists, and they want many of the useless features to be put on the new disruptive solution. How do you fight that? Do you say that you're not going to ever do that because you don't really need it? Or do you say that over time it will be there, knowing very well that it would not be?
Great. So let me give you the big picture and then drill down. It turns out we only have one word for startup. Anybody ever hear the apocryphal story that Eskimos have 43 names for snow? You know, like the slushy snow and dry snow and snow that the polar bear eats you on and, you know, the other kind. We only have one word for startup. Turns out there are four, in my taxonomy, 4 types of startups. One is you're entering an existing market. How do we know it's an existing market? What do we know about an existing market? Customers. What else do you have? Competitors, right? What else? What can those customers tell you if they're competitors? What can they tell you? What can those customers tell you in an existing market? Yeah, they could tell you features, they could tell you pricing, et cetera. And in fact, in an existing market, you just go out and talk to them, they'll tell you the basis of competition. Some existing markets have dominant competitors where you don't want to go head on. And so you might decide that you want to resegment an existing market. That is, either take a niche because you understand customer features better than, or needs better than anybody else, or you might want to be a low-cost supplier. That's my definition of existing. Or there's a third type. You think you're so disruptive, you're going to create a new market. How many customers are in a new market? 0. Okay. By the way, you can enter a new market. How much cash do you need in a new market? Might be a lot. You and your investors better be aligned about market type. Because if you're giving them the 5-year forecast that, you know, is linear, or even worse, the canonical hockey stick that says, oh, magic happens here, right? All of a sudden, you're betting on some tipping point that truly is some fantasy. So what customers have been telling you is one of 2 things. You're trying to describe it as disruptive, but they're willing to buy, some segment is willing to buy now, interesting play, or they don't quite believe that you're disruptive, and you haven't found an early evangelist. So let me explain. In every market, if you're building something other than an existing, and resegmenting or new, if you can't find people who share your vision early on, you're hallucinating. You're not a visionary, right? You're 95% of the time, you know, you think you're a visionary, you've actually been smoking something or we're hitting on the head, right? So you need to decide, right? If no one else, doesn't mean everybody, in a new market or resegment, if everybody says it's great, you're actually in an existing market. If 1 out of 20 or 1 out of 50 says, I've been dreaming about the same thing, if you can't find any of those people, you're wrong. Does that make sense or not? All right, so I'm not trying to discourage you. I'm saying there's a lot more moves and choices because, by the way, if you are disruptive, you don't want everybody to say, well, yes, I get it, because that's the wrong thing that you're trying to build, right? And you don't want everybody to say, yes, this is exactly what I want. Yeah? Have time for more? You guys pick. Anybody else? Go on. Yeah?
Tested this business model Canvas with some venture capitalists.
Yes. So 10 years ago, you know, the way when people would ask that question, I changed the subject by saying, "Isn't that Steve Jobs coming in the door?" And you know, we changed the subject. And 5 years ago, you know, people would say, "Well, that's nice theory, and that's great." I say probably now in Silicon Valley, almost every VC gives lip service to lean and customer development and whatever. And I'd say there's probably maybe 5 who actually understand what the hell it means, but there's at least every one of them will say something like it's important. That why I know, and no joke aside, I now teach with 10 of them. That is, in the different classes I offer for Stanford and for Berkeley and National Science Foundation, I kind of co-opted a bunch of existing Silicon Valley VCs who actually teach the process. And you know, not only have they drank the Kool-Aid, they've begun to see the difference in their portfolio. It might be an age thing, it might be, but I tend to find VCs under 40 kind of get it more than the guys who grew up like I did, which were write the business plan for me, and when you come in, give me your PowerPoint slides. But I'll give you the equivalent. In fact, let me tell you a story, because it works every time. So all of you, probably as good as my students, and you know, I give a challenge for my students, which is, I bet you if you lock yourself away in the Stanford library for a weekend, business library, you could write a world-class business plan and derive the VC PowerPoint slides for them. Because that's, by the way, what a standard VC pitch is. Show me your PowerPoint slides, which is essentially the summary of your business plan. You could fake it in a weekend, is my point. Here's what you can't fake. Get out of the building and talk to 100 customers in 8 weeks. 100 customers. I have students who do this. 100 customers in 8 weeks. And now go in with lessons learned from 100 customers, telling the story of not where I ended up. Here's what I thought on day one. Here's what happened when I found X. Here's what happened when I found, not talking about business models or customer development, just the story of what you learned talking to 100 people. Let me tell you, if you do that in a VC boardroom, even though they think that they want to see, show me the standard PowerPoint, these guys will do one or two things. 15% odds they'll throw you right out of the room. Just telling you the honest truth. 85% of the time, they'll put down whatever they were typing on their iPhone or BlackBerry and look at you like, you did what? Well, I talked to 100 customers, and here, it doesn't guarantee you're going to get funded, but it does guarantee that they're going to pay attention, because for the first time, probably this month, you're going to teach them something they had no idea about. It is not possible they know what you know, which normally is not the case. Does that answer part of the question? And by the way, I tell everybody who gets kind of wrapped up in the lean or customer development religion, for God's sake, don't proselytize the religion. I don't care whether it's lean or customer development or whatever. Come in and tell me and teach me something that you learned that you couldn't have learned anywhere else, or that no one else has been learning. I don't want to see your market forecast. I want to see that you've got thrown out of some of the best places, and here's what some other people said about why they'd buy. You can't fake that. That's what this process is about. Does that? Who has the best question? No, best question. You really have the best question? Really? Okay, go. We're gonna take a vote on this, and you're between them and, because we don't need it if it's not the best question. Yes. It's incredibly hard. Very hard. So the gentleman who was up here, the CEO before, who was sitting here, had exactly the right attitude. I was sitting going, yeah, that's the right kind of founder. If you haven't been thrown out, or chased somebody, or are capable of telling a story in a reality distortion field, you really need to get those skills somewhere in your company, in the founding team. So for example, where do I start? I have employees who know people. I have advisors, and if you don't have any advisors, you need some. I have Silicon Valley Bank. You want to, in fact, shake down by the ankles everybody you know. You're a founder. You're no longer polite. You left good manners away the minute you took this job. Right? You need to be asking everybody you know for help. And what you want is a name of somebody they know. And my best line of starting to meet people works all the time. I'll send an email, or better, call after 5 p.m. where their admins and secretaries go home. And when you get them on the phone, say, hi, my name is X. I got your name from Y. Y is hopefully somebody they know. I'm not calling to sell you something. I'm calling you because so-and-so told me you were the smartest person in this industry, and I need 5 minutes of your time. Now tell me, if somebody called you saying that, what are the odds you're going to hang up? Let's say maybe 50%. That's a pretty good hit rate. I did that for 20 years. 20 years. And I would call people in New York, and if they said, oh, Tuesday, I'd say, very funny, I'm going to be in New York on Tuesday. I'd get on an airplane for that. And I'd make 5 more of those calls and get some more meetings in New York. But you need to be relentless. You know, I used to think, because I was an engineer, and my definition of an engineer, the difference between an introvert and an extrovert and an engineer is whether they were looking at their shoes or your shoes. And I finally, no, I could say that because I used to be, and now I teach engineers how to make eye contact. But in the old days, you know, I used to think telephones were going to dial themselves, and I would just hope that somehow this stuff would happen. This was incredibly hard for me, so I'm like sympathetic to you. Are you an engineer? All right, good. You have an advantage over most people in this room. It is really hard to kind of impose yourself in a process that normally you don't fit in. And so you're now asking for a short period of time. And what entrepreneurs make the fatal mistake is thinking the customer development process is somehow on day one, I need to give somebody a pitch. That is, I'm selling something, or I want them to look at my slides. I don't let you out of the building with your slides. You literally are going out the first time to understand whether your hypothesis about their problem is even correct. You don't need a slide deck for that. That's a casual conversation, right? And eventually what you're trying to do is understand the 2 most important parts is, does my value proposition match my customer segment? And the buzzword for that is product market fit, right? Everybody hear that? Well, and it's a fairly popular word. Once I have product market fit, the value proposition and customer segment, I'm like 50% on the way of making some money. And so the conversations begin, though, is my assumptions about my value prop and who the customer is even correct on the planet. Does that help for conversation? Okay, that was a pretty good question. So let's go eat. Talk to you soon.